Conversation a couple weeks ago with a guy who claimed to be a Christian. I say claim because like 0% of Christians actually understand what Christianity is. But it was this really interesting point because he was saying that he agreed that we should make the world better. So he was saying like, hey, I don't understand why, because I was giving a speech somewhere and he was there and he came to me afterwards and he's like, I don't understand why you're saying people who believe in God or Christians don't want to create a world that's best for all. No Christians think that. Like, what Christians are you talking to? Like, as if I was like making up some idea of Christians in my mind and attacking them or something. And I wasn't particularly picking on Christians, other than in speaking to Christians, there was a fear that as a Christian you can't forgive yourself because only Jesus has the power to forgive, or the authority, I suppose. And so I was addressing that point of like, don't use God or Jesus as an excuse not to change the system to be best for all. Because if you have this idea of the higher power, then you can't forgive yourself because you're not ultimately responsible, and therefore you can't change anything. And that was my basic point. It wasn't anti-Christian or anti-God. But anyways, this guy comes up to me and he's like, I don't understand why you're acting like, and he wasn't being a dick about it or something. He was being very genuine, but so I'm kind of doing a caricature, but he was kind of like, I understand why you're attacking Christians about this. Like, Christians want to make the world better. And so I was like, well, I'm open to the idea that you can believe in God and be a Christian and also change the system, as long as you don't use it as an excuse in any way, like go so far and then like, well, I can't really change anything because God or because Jesus. And so I said, well, let me kind of find out what you believe. What do you see? Like, I want to see, like, are you using it as an excuse or not, if we're going to really look at this, right? So he said, he basically gave an argument that, of course, there's a God because if you look around, everything's obviously created, right? I'm just like, okay, I don't disagree with that. That doesn't imply that the thing that created anything that you see is the highest power or fundamentally superior than you either, superior to you. And when I pushed that point, it like kind of wasn't going anywhere, because he kept coming to, well, regardless, I want to, for example, he was picking on the point of, well, you guys, you're all about literacy, right? Because, techno tutor and so forth. So, let's look at literacy. And he was showing up all these statistics about how literacy has improved over time since the 1800s or something, right? And obviously I challenged him on those points, because saying that more people read at a 4th grade level, that to me is not an increase in literacy. Like when I look at the level my 7-year-old can read at, which is the level of a intelligent high schooler, I don't base my standards of improved literacy around the world based on everyone getting to a 4th grade level. I look at how the elite read and I say, can everyone do that? Because if everyone can't do that, we haven't changed the literacy problem. So he was looking at poverty then. Okay, so let's look at poverty. Starvation specifically. And he said, you guys want to end starvation. But the problem isn't money, because we say it's changing the money system that will end starvation. And he said, it's not that. It's the problem is there's not enough food. Or the people don't have food, rather, is what he said. So we just have to give them food. And I said, well, in itself, that's not the answer, because there would still be poor people or people who are starving. You're not solving the problem, you're just putting a Band-Aid on it. So his idea of fixing that problem was really just charity, which is kind of the approach you learn when you're in church, for example. I think he was a Roman Catholic. And so I was explaining to him, like, no, the system itself creates poverty. And he was really he was having a hard time accepting that and seeing that. And we talked for many hours, and there was other people talking too and giving input and stuff. And it was really cool, because I got to this one point where I said, okay, you're a Christian, right? Oh, and just to give more context real quick, his whole point kind of was that, well, we have capitalism, there's always been poverty, and capitalism is alleviating poverty over time. It's getting better, kind of like with the literacy thing. It's getting better. It's not perfect, but it's getting better. And sort of like it's always been a problem, it's just a fact, and then it's just getting better. And it's interesting because, just a side note, I guess, it's no different than the argument of evolution, actually. It's like we started off as pond scum, and then we're just getting better. We started off, we're just sinners, and we're just getting better, basically, right? So there's no reason to change anything fundamentally because everything is already improving. And so I'm like, well, what's the fucking point of believing in Jesus or anything then at this point? But it's like he couldn't really see that yet, right? So we're looking at these points, and I said, okay, because I said, where does history start for you? Because if you go back to what you're taught in school as the beginning of history, that's not really the beginning of history. And I don't need to rely on this point as the proof. It's just, for example, if you have the idea that there's human beings and there's never been anything like human beings before, and like we're the first example of sentient beings that have ever existed because we've evolved from like the pond scum, the single-celled organisms, whatever, up through the monkeys, and monkeys became us, and then so therefore there's never been any sentient creatures before. That's really no different than what Christians believe, because it's the same thing. It's like God created everything. God created humans, and then that was the first people, beings that were like other than God, like, in a way sentient or conscious or aware or something, right? So I'm like, where are you starting history from? Because what if it goes back before that? What if it's like if you thought that like the American civilization, American empire, the Western world, just the American empire was the first civilization. And it's like, just because you started at the American Revolution or something, which obviously would be hard to justify why there was a revolution, but if you just go back to the 1800s, let's say, and you're like, see, and there was America and it's just getting better. And it's like, well, but there was civilizations before that. In other words, something can exist now that existed in the past, a civilization, an empire. Human beings are sentient, let's say, beings that are walking around influencing reality and so forth, different than you would imagine an animal does or a plant does or something like that. Who's to say, I'm just speaking from a purely theoretical perspective, or hypothetical, I suppose. Who's to say it's the first time there's ever been sentient beings? It's like, well, what are you talking about? Look at the bones that the archaeologists have discovered. I'm like, oh, all that shit is fucking manipulated. And it's not even necessarily deliberately manipulated. It's just, when you look at the way our world works, people are building their career around studying information and then coming up with new ideas, and people take that becomes the popular idea. People expand upon that. It's not because it's true. It's just because that's the thing that kind of took off. It's just like fashion. Like, it's very similar. It's like somebody came up with this idea of what pants should look like, and then people modified that, and then someone comes up with a new idea, and then everyone's all about that. Like, why do we wear pants the way we wear? If you look at it, like, there's a lot of different ways you could wear something, right? You could wear clothing. And so archaeology, science, how many different types of theories are there of what the physical universe is? String theory, quantum mechanics. I'm sure there's 100 at least different ideas of what the world is. And none of them are proven. They're all ideas. So the idea that history began with the single-celled organisms through evolution, the idea that it began in the beginning 6,000 years ago or whatever, the way the Bible apparently says it, it's all just ideas. So, but if you think that way, then of course you're going to think, well, look how bad it was back then, and now we're getting better. But then I really looked at this point, I was like, okay, hold on. Let's say you're a Christian, and you believe that the Bible is essentially true, and that God created everything, created Adam and Eve, created the Garden of Eden, they were in it, right? Just like it says in the Bible. Just like one interpretation of what it says in the Bible is, And let's assume you took all that at face value, like what most people believe as the basic idea of the creation story in Christianity. If I'm pausing, it's just because there's a poor connection. I don't know if it's actually pausing anything or if it's just pausing on my side. I don't know. But let's say you took all that at face value, the Christianity Genesis story. Okay, God created Adam and Eve, and they disobeyed him somehow, and got kicked out of the garden. So before they got kicked out of the garden, was there poverty then? The idea that poverty has always existed, I don't think is something Christians actually believe. But it's like, maybe they believe history starts at the time you got kicked out of the garden. So let's look at that point, okay? This is why I was saying, did God create poverty? Because I'm like, okay, let me go into it. So God creates this garden, puts people in it. And just if I'm taking the story at face value, not trying to read deeper meaning into it, just at face value. Basically, as far as I can tell, everything is good. There's like abundance, everybody's getting along, there's no fear, there's no real basic, there's no competition, there's no fear for survival. It's like they have everything they need. It's kind of like awesome. Like I think everyone's conception of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden was like it was an idyllic situation, right? Okay, so they're in this garden, and God says there's this tree, and it contains the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and don't eat that. Don't eat from that tree. And then the whole story with the snake, and he gives the apple to, or the fruit, whatever it is, to Eve. Eve eats it, and then she gives it to Adam. He eats it, right? And then God is like, hey, what the hell? I told you not to eat from that. And you're out. You're kicked out of the garden. Okay, and then that introduces all this negative stuff, like labor pains, you have to work for your survival, like all this other stuff. So it's kind of like the beginning of the system as we know it. But people who believe in this story, at some level, I think, must believe that before we got kicked out of the garden, everything was okay. So, like, it was possible for God to create that for us. I mean, it happened, according to the story. And then we must have done something to screw it up. And that thing was, eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, what the hell does that mean? I mean, it's so vague, the way it's written. It's really so open to interpretation. But even if I just look at it at face value, does it seem like it implies that before you eat from this tree, if you eat this fruit from this tree, you don't know what good and evil is? I mean, what else is it trying to say? Just according to the way it's translated and kind of written and understood, generally speaking. Like, let's say you're a new person to Christianity, you're at church, and they're like, and then God, they said, do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Wouldn't you be like, why not? Why shouldn't we eat from it? Now, let's say you were Adam or you were Eve, and you're like, God, why shouldn't I eat from this tree? And he's like, because it would be bad. It's like, well, what does that mean? I mean, isn't this tree giving you the knowledge of good and evil? So was it an evil thing? Was it even a sin? Because a sin is like an evil thing, right? It's like you're going against God. But that concept of why is it, like, if you're totally innocent and you don't know what good and bad is, how do you know what it means? How do you know it's a bad thing to go against God? If God says don't do this, why, like, if you don't know the difference between good and evil, doing what God says or not doing what God says would be equally valid options from your perspective, because why should I do what God says? Why not? Like, why not? Like, what's my... So it's like almost this implication of they should have just obeyed because he was God. And like, he gave everything, imprinting children with just obey your parents blindly kind of. But if you're a parent, I'm a parent, and I have 3 kids, and they're super fucking smart and stable emotionally. I always explain everything. I don't allow them to do things that would harm them or harm each other. They're allowed to make mistakes. They're allowed to fail sometimes. They're very stable, but I explain everything. It's just like an extra thing you can do as a parent, and it makes your kids really smart, in addition to using Technotutor. But that's why I can explain a lot of things that parents normally wouldn't be able to explain to their children, because they wouldn't be able to understand. So it's like, I'm telling you, don't hold that knife like that. Don't hold that knife like that, because it'll cut your fingers. If a child doesn't understand fingers, knife, hold, what's the concept of cutting? Why is that a problem? Like, then they don't know. And if you just go like, I told you not to do that, you're just afraid they're going to cut their fingers. You're afraid they might cut them in the future. So you're trying to use fear to get them just to not do it anymore. Like, that's actually just really fucked, right? So if I place myself as God, as the parent in this situation of Adam and Eve, right, I would explain to them why not to eat from that tree, because then they would understand. And then I would also, as God, make sure that they have the ability to process what I'm saying and understand, have the ability to understand what I'm saying, and then give them the understanding through talking. I mean, that's the whole thing of God creates through words, right? So we should be able to create that for them, that understanding. But that clearly didn't happen. So who is to blame in this situation? Adam and Eve? Like, what did they do that was so bad? They disobeyed God. Okay. But let's go back for a second. And I don't know if I talked about this on my last video or not, but another thing that people who believe in God, even people who don't, is, I'm not just picking on people who believe in God. Like, if you don't believe in God, you're also retarded. But people who believe in God, it's like that's the word they're using as their excuse. It's like, well, there's evil because we choose. God makes everything perfect, but we choose evil. And I'm like, well, no. Why doesn't God just make everything good, make you good? It's like, well, he gives us free will. Okay, so he gives you free will. So what was the problem then back in the garden? Did you have free will or not? When you were Adam and Eve in the garden, did you have free will? God said you can do anything you want, but eat from that tree. That's not free will. And you're like, well, they could have chosen not to do it. Again, okay, why shouldn't they do it? Because you're disobeying God. Well, that's not a reason, because that's like saying you don't have the freedom to make any choice. Because, so, well, if you disobey God and you're not aligned with God, then you're not allowing how things actually work to flow through you. You're going against the nature of things. I'm like, okay, that's fine. But it doesn't seem in the story like that was made clear to them, like they understood that. And it's interesting because as a parent, aren't you like, well, if I just give everything to my kid and I don't teach him anything, they're just going to be a spoiled brat. That is true. Like, to the degree that you don't educate them also. Doesn't mean your child should suffer and struggle and starve so that they're not spoiled, but they should have what they need. But also, you should educate them, like, and give them responsibility. But along with that is the understanding of what that responsibility is and why. And sometimes they are going to make mistakes, but that's only because as parents, you're not good enough at giving them the ability to process what you're saying. And it takes time as human beings to develop into that, right? But that's also a lot of consequences that we've created over time, where our ability to just understand, we don't come prepackaged with understanding of things. But that's because it's us as humans that are directing what the child learns. It's not God. If it was God, couldn't God just like, you know everything. You know everything you need to know. Done. Now, any choice you make is with full awareness of the consequence. Because if the argument is that, well, they chose wrong because they didn't know, because they needed to learn about consequence. It's like, okay, then why couldn't that have just been like God said, now look, see, the consequence here is this little thing that happened. See, do you understand consequence now? Okay, let's go back to the garden now. And you understand consequence now, so now you can actually live here. It was like, nope, first mistake, you're fucking out. You're on your own. Now you got to suffer. You got to toil. It's like, what? That's kind of extreme. That'd be like if you told your kid, hey, you need to do everything I say, okay? And then they're like, okay. And then you're like, hey, don't eat that apple. And you eat the apple. You're like, oh, that's it. And you start like beating them, and you throw them on the ground, and you kick them, and you're like, you take them off into like some other city and just drop them off and leave them and say bye-bye. You're like, that's so fucking extreme. Like, what? and you don't give them any understanding of how to do anything, and they're just like, oh, you're on your own now, you didn't listen. It's like, what did I do? I'm not even gonna they don't even explain what you actually did wrong. The whole story makes no sense. So then as a Christian, it's like, how do you reconcile this in your mind, this story, which is the introduction of sin, the original sin, was just doing something that you didn't know any better not to do. And then suddenly everything that ever... So was that the creation of poverty? Because that was the point where you left the garden and things weren't given to you anymore. Who's responsible for that? I'm not actually blaming God, because I don't believe in the story. Like, I do understand the story, and I understand there's actually more context to the story. And if you want a really great perspective, I don't remember what specific blog post it is, but if you go through Heaven's Journey to Life, heavensjourneytolife.blogspot.com, and you start reading those from you go to the timeline and go to day one, you start reading them. Eventually it explains what that story actually means and why that story exists, like what it's actually impulsing. It's like, think about a pharmaceutical commercial, right? What they're really trying to get you to do is to feel really good about the thing that they're selling, even though there might be some negative side effects. And they always say what those are at the end. But I think people have done studies on this, and like, people don't actually hear those negative things. They just get impulsed by the imagery. So all the pictures of the imagery is like people having fun and feeling confident and doing great. And it's like, they're not even really explaining what the thing does. It's just kind of like this vague imagery that you're going to have a better experience or life. It's not really specific. They're not like, here's the exact chemistry of how it works, and here's what the problem is and why the problem occurs. Like, they don't do any of that. So, but they're trying to program with you just a good feeling about this thing. It's kind of like that with the Bible. I'm not saying it's programming you with a good feeling about something, but all these stories, they're like written and they're put into our reality, and they resonate, and people read them, and then they have that inside of them, and it's like a program that everyone's downloading. And the program is not what it appears to be on the surface. It's like, do you remember literature class in school, and you had to read something and then like analyze it and give the deeper meaning of it? And it's like, oh, so wait, when the guy, the rose died in the story, that was actually symbolizing the fleeting nature that's being impulsed into humanity. That's why I'm always saying you're controlled by your belief in God, because you don't actually understand what God is. It's manipulated. You're doing it to yourself because you don't want to take self-responsibility, but it's a manipulated concept that the actual responsibility that each of us needs to take as beings in reality, that responsibility gets projected onto something as a higher power. And the really sinister aspect of it is that you think you're a good person by doing that, by actually doing the most evil thing possible, which is abdicating self-responsibility for reality. Because, man, there is a great... So in the Self-Perfected group, we're now doing this Destiny book club thing where every week there's an audio or a article or something that we, generally speaking as a group agree, like, hey, let's do this one. Anyways, we pick one, and everyone listens to it, puts comments and stuff. And it's just a cool exercise to do as a group for fun, but to go through the material kind of in a more systematic way. Although, obviously, if that's the only thing you read each week, it's going to take you a long time. But it's just a cool thing to do as a book club kind of thing. Well, anyway, so this next week is going to be this blog from the Destiny webpage, which you can find if you do a Google search, or maybe just go to Destiny, DESTENI.org, and you do a search in there. Jesus Responsibility. Or if you just go into Jesus Responsibility Destiny, spelled like I told you, put that in Google, you'll find the article. And it's so good, man. It explains this point of if you really understand the real Jesus message, read that. What Jesus was really saying, what he was really all about. But we really only have one choice, and it is to manifest heaven on earth. You say that's not a choice. There's always two options in any choice, right? Well, the other option is, or suffer until you do that. I mean, doesn't that just seem obvious? Either you're going to make the best experience for yourself and everybody else, or you're going to suffer until you do. That's not a God imposing that. That's just the common sense of reality. Either you're going to, for example, either you're going to cook a meal and then eat it and be full, or you're just going to be hungry until you do. Like, that's just how it obviously would work. We're either going to create heaven on earth or suffer until we do. There's nowhere else to go. There's no heaven out there. There's only heaven on earth when we create it. Because the earth is the physical reality. There is no reality beyond the physical reality. There can't be. Because if there is, it's not real. There's no reality beyond reality. The reality you want heaven to be is a mental fantasy. It's not real. Look at you. Look at you. Look around you. Right? Let's see if I can turn the camera around. I'm assuming that's this button. That's a garden. Right? That's physically real. The stuff that goes on in your mind is not physically real. Do you feel better when you go and you play sports or just go on a walk with your friends, or when you play video games? Do you feel better when you feel really passionate towards your spouse and you have sex, or when you go watch porn? Do you feel better when you eat a really good home-cooked meal of food grown from a garden, or when you go eat McDonald's? Like, there's the real and there's the illusion stuff. Like, why do I pick on McDonald's? Because a lot of that stuff, as far as I can see, is just like chemically altered to make it taste good. If it wasn't chemically altered to taste, I don't think it tastes good, but you know, if you have that acquired taste, if it wasn't chemically altered with a bunch of extra salt and sugar and stuff, you wouldn't like the taste of it. They have to do that because otherwise you wouldn't eat it. But like, you could just go get one of these tomatoes. Well, I'm not going to flip it around again. You can't see them anyways. I could just go grab one of these ripe tomatoes and eat it, and it's like, wow, that's good. I'm not even like a person who loves tomatoes. Because it's real. It's not fake. Like, and then you get nourishment from it. It's anyways. Point is, the heaven that you're looking for is not a real heaven. It's like just sort of an experience. It's an imaginary thing. And what it is actually, if you're being self-honest, you'll see this for yourself. But what it is actually is it's just a reaction to the physical reality being so, like, well, I say the physical reality, but let me clarify. It's your life, what you call your life, seeming so hard and full of stress and fear and trauma and sadness and despair and depression and all these things that every single person feels. I don't care how much positivity you project outwardly. You're a fucking liar. You feel sadness and all these things too, just like every single person on earth. The only way you can cover it up is with money. You say, well, I don't have a lot of money, but I'm happy. It's like, no, you're not. Because you're not starving to death. So you have enough money. So you're like, well, I'm not rich. Are you like a fucking child living in the red light district in India, like in a slum, like fucking basically about to get sold to some fucking 40-year-old dude for like sex stuff because your parents can't afford to keep you as a child? You know, like, give me a fucking break, dude. Like, oh, I don't need money. It's like, okay, give me all your money then, throw it all, just give it all away 100%. Do not use money then. It's like, you're just lying. You have enough to be comfortable. I'm not saying being rich is the key to happiness, but having enough money to have your basic needs met is a key in that whole process. Because if it wasn't, why would you even empathize with people who don't have anything? Because you fucking know. And you're brainwashed to think that God is going to favor you if you feel kindness towards those people. But in any case, the idea of heaven in this fantasy sense is a reaction to life actually being difficult. And when you go and read that article that I was talking about, that Jesus Responsibility article, it explains in there the reality that what Jesus was here to show us was who we really are. He was showing us who we really are as who he is. The problem is in your mind, because you've been so brainwashed, whether you believe in Jesus or not, you've been so brainwashed to imagine the Jesus as like this superhero character. It's not what Jesus was. That's the brainwashing. Jesus was actually here to show, like, hey, here's who we really are. And who we really are, intrinsically, the expression of who we really are, in its full expression, without any hindrance, without any counter intention, counter thought, counter action, whatever, the full expression of who we really are is heaven on earth. Like, when we are fully expressing who we really are all together as one, equally, the expression of that is heaven on earth. It is what we imagine the Garden of Eden is. It's not what we imagine heaven is, because again, that's like some fantasy bullshit. There will still be work required, but the work will be enjoyable. Like working in a garden, if you have enough money where you don't have to worry about your survival, and you could just work in a garden. I mean, that's what a lot of women, especially, and even men, I'm sure, but a lot of women, their idea is if they can retire and then they have enough money, they don't have to worry about their survival, they just want to work in their garden. Because it's fun. It's a really enjoyable process. Women want to have kids. Imagine if you just had enough money, well, you don't have to stress at all about anything with their health care, the kids, clothing, anything, and you could just be with them and support them and educate them. Like that would be, to a lot of people, heaven. So it's not this fantasy thing of like, I don't know what people imagine it is. I certainly don't understand why you would think it's sitting at the feet of God praising hallelujah 1,000 times like it says in the Bible. Like, why that would be anyone's concept of paradise, I don't know, because nobody does that. Like, oh, it's time to go on vacation from work, let me go just sit in church and praise hallelujah 1,000 times. Like, no, let me go to the Bahamas. Like, what? Okay, so real heaven is just all of us in our full expression as who we actually are. That is our intrinsic nature. Our intrinsic nature is not sin. The idea that we are fundamentally flawed, we weren't, because God didn't create us that way. Even if you believe in the Bible creation story, that was not how we were created. We were created as perfect, good. The only reason we got kicked out, apparently, is because we disobeyed God, even though we didn't understand why. I mean, if you were in that situation, would you have disobeyed? Or would you have just been like, hey, I'm cool with not eating it because there's plenty around here, but can you explain to me why so I understand? Because, you know, I might have kids someday and I'd like to have them to understand, and I'm going to take that responsibility. That's the reason why somehow inherently we're like, that explains human nature. It's so dumb. It's so dumb. Wouldn't it make more sense that we are inherently good, and for whatever reason we're not yet seeing the simplicity of that, and for whatever reason, but let's just say for whatever reason, and do for self-forgiveness. Forgive yourself. And I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to believe that it is not possible to have heaven on earth. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to believe that I am fundamentally flawed, inherently, intrinsically, that I cannot create heaven on earth as an expression of who I am. Like, sit and really do the self-forgiveness for yourself and mean it. And what's interesting too is like the whole idea of God, it's like all about inferiority, superiority. So anybody who starts talking like, maybe even the way I'm talking, it's like, oh, you think you're special, you think you're God. It's like, no, that's totally missing the point. Like, imagine you're on a sports team and this sports team isn't playing as well as it could. And somebody comes in and they're like a big hot shot, big ego, they're really good, and then everyone's just like, and they're like playing so good, and like, come on guys, what the hell, but everything they're doing is from ego, they're not really, versus anyone else comes in who's really good, or maybe they're just as good as everyone else on the team, and they just start motivating everybody, like, hey guys, think about what we could do, like with our talent here, we could be so much better, but we're just participating in this illusion that like we're not good and we can, and we're participating in fear and laziness and all these things. Like, let's just, how much fun would it be to play better, you know? And then everyone says like, oh, look at this guy trying to be, you know, Mr. Hotshot, and it's like, is he trying to be Mr. Hotshot, or is he just like, hey everybody, let's stop? But in that statement of, hey, let's stop participating in all these negative things, everyone feels that energy inside, that fire coming up. And you don't want to face that, because that is a consequence of going against what you really are. Because if you just did the forgiveness and let it go, it would be gone. So there's this choice we each have to make. Are we going to choose to, are we going to continue to reject who we really are, which will only just create more and more suffering forever until we change it? Or will we embrace who we are, which is the expression of which is heaven on earth, and just start doing that? And I know it seems hard and seems challenging and there's a lot of resistance, but that is just part of the suffering and pain that is coming along with not embracing who we are. So it's just even more showing the consequence. Like, if it's hard to create heaven on earth now, yes, this is the point. Because we've not embraced who we are, and we've created all these consequences. Part of that just being this programming of internal resistance towards creating heaven on earth through all kinds of means, through all kinds of justifications, individually and collectively. That's part of what we're saying is the pain and suffering we're going to have to go through to do it. It's not like, oh, you know what? Okay. Actually, yeah, we should have heaven on earth. And then suddenly it's just done. I mean, if everyone at the same time realized it, yeah, it could just be done. But the problem is the consequence right now is that it's really hard for everybody to realize it. So for those people who are like, oh, yes, I'm realizing it, I'm seeing it, I'm understanding it, we have to stand up and support other people to see it. And people are going to say all kinds of negative shit. That's just, again, part of the consequence we've all created. We can't utilize it as... It'd be like if you're trying to put out a fire in your house, but you're using the fact that it's really hot. But using the fact that it's really hot as to why you can't put out the fire. Well, it's just too hot. Yeah, that's because the house is on fire. But that's not a reason not to do it. That's a reason to do it, because it's only going to get hotter. It's only going to get worse. And at the end, you're not going to have a house. And then you're going to have to rebuild the house. How much effort is going to have to go into that? I mean, I know it's an analogy. But anything negatively we're going to experience in the context of changing the system is something we've created. Any fear that we experience is something we've created. All of us collectively since the beginning of time. And that goes back a lot longer than anyone even can conceive, really. I really suggest to read that Destiny, Jesus Responsibility article, is it really puts it into perspective. And also shows, too, the reason why Jesus failed in getting his real message across was because people couldn't process it. It just even shows the point about what we're saying with vocabulary being important, because people could not process it. And so the system, the elite, who had a high vocabulary, knew exactly how to manipulate the masses with the image, to manipulate with the image of Jesus was really saying, hey, the real problem in existence is no one's taking self-responsibility, and we're not all taking self-responsibility, and therefore creating heaven on earth. That's who we really are. We don't want to take responsibility. And then the system uses that to turn everyone even further into not taking responsibility by being like, see this guy, how special he was? Don't take any responsibility. Put it all on him. He'll save you. And it's like, holy shit, man, that's really missing the point. That's like the fucking opposite of what he was saying. But you got to realize there's so much ingrained programming in each one of us to just follow. To follow. And in the hierarchy of human society, the less you follow, the better position you have in society. You're still following the program, the entire system, but the hierarchical position you stand in, you get more slaves, basically. That's the fucking truth of everything in our world. But why is the slave less than the slave master? Fundamentally. Even people who try to justify slavery from the past, of like, well, it actually wasn't as bad as they say it was, and the slave master, he just took responsibility for the plantation and the slaves had a place to eat. Okay, I get that, but the problem there is we don't have a system that just educates the slaves to be equal to the slave master. Because then there can't be any slavery. Because honestly, do you want to be a slave master anyways? Maybe when you're the slave, you feel like it'd be better, but imagine how much... you're still a slave. The slave master's still a slave because you're still having to fucking stand there and take responsibility and do all this shit for everybody else and control them all the time. Like, do you really want to be Bill Gates? Do you really want to be fucking any of these people that you blame? It's the following program. And it's interesting because just like with Jesus, they turn it into like, oh, Jesus will take responsibility for you. That's the opposite of what he was saying. It's like, well, if anybody comes together as a group and stands with common principles, you must be a cult. You're just following. You're just brainwashed. And it's like the entire world is fucking brainwashed. The entire world is just following. So anybody who's saying that is just trying to provoke fear inside of you and self-judgment. But if you literally don't care what people think, you won't care about that because you'll be like, that's not true. It's just bullshit. I'm not following something because I'm brainwashed by it. I'm following it to the degree that what is it following? How are you following it? How do you follow create a world that's best for all? What is there to follow? You have to fucking create it. If you're going to build a garden, do you have to follow some steps? Yeah. Is there some things you have to figure out? Yeah. Are you just building a garden because you're brainwashed? It's possible, but let me ask you a question. Are you speaking English or whatever language you speak natively because it's your choice? How much effort are you going to have to put into speaking a different language? And then even if you do, what do you have to do? Then you have to brainwash yourself to do that. So this whole accusation of anybody brainwashing anybody is like, what's the point of school? Don't you put your kid in school so they'll brainwash your kid? Isn't that the fucking point? So they will brainwash them? If your kid comes home and says the opposite of what they say in school and they say F, don't you be like, that's not good. You should have said exactly what they told you and got the A. Like, that's literally fucking brainwashing. When people go to church and they sit there and they question God, are they like, oh, please, at the end of the sermon, any questions, any objections? Who here doesn't agree with anything I say? Or are they just wanting you to say the words, pray, put the money in the basket, and then act like other people are brainwashed who are saying we need to change the system to be best for all? Let's just move past this point. Get past the fear. Do the forgiveness on that. It's all words. And within you are a lot of words. And they will have emotional charge or they won't. They will have correct definitions or they won't. If you had all the words that exist inside of you with the correct definitions and no unnecessary emotional charge, and you actually understood what stuff meant, how much more powerful and effective would you be in your reality? And if everyone had that, how much more amazing would our reality be? So, did God create poverty? Or are we creating it through allowing a system of inequality, especially within the context of education?